Good evening, everyone. Good morning to, to Canada. So we have with us Alfred Hermida. A lot of you already know him and you know his work. But for the ones who don't know him, Alfred is a professor in the School of Journalism of the University of British Columbia and the co-founder of the Conversation Canada. And he has also worked for 16 years for the BBC and other outlets. And for us in the academia, his work is, amazing. Everyone who is working and writing papers on journalism uses his work because, correct me if I'm wrong, Alfred, but I think you are in the industry for 25 years writing papers and publishing books,
Yes.
right? So he is an expert in journalism, social media, everything new in journalism. He's the person to talk to. So we're very happy to have you here with us, and we can't wait to have you in Greece, presenting in the IT Media Conference in the future. So the floor is yours, and after your talk, we will have some questions from the journalists and the scholars in the group. So thank you very much again.
Great. Thank you very much, Catherine, for the introduction, and thank you for the welcome. Thank you all for being here. What I'm going to talk today is about, obviously, AI in journalism. But for me, I want to give you a way of how to think about it and to go beyond the way we've tended to think about it so far. So I'm going to start by going back to the future. I'm going to start by going to the 18th century. And the reason I want to start there is because this is a time when Europeans were fascinated with what looked like artificial life, what looked like machines that could do what humans could do. And these were two of them. 1760, the miracle writing machine, the first one on the slide, that would write. And then you had the other one, the writer, which was essentially mimicking like somebody writing with a quill on paper. And I want to start here because at the time, these were seen in some ways the way we see AI now, as doing what humans do, replicating what they do, writing like humans do, and they sort of wowed Europeans at the time. Now, what's interesting with all of these is, at the time, people were also fascinated by this thing. This thing is a defecating duck. So this is a duck that would seemingly eat some food, and then a few minutes later would excrete the waste at the other end. It went on display in Paris in 1738, and people were wowed by this defecating duck. They couldn't believe that you had a machine that could eat and then defecate at the same time. Of course, it's not a living organism, it's a machine, it was a mechanism, it had different bits of the machine that would take in food and get rid of food. But to people looking at this in Paris, they would thought this is artificial life. They were wowed by it. And in a way, it's the way we're being wowed by AI now. And so when we think of the discussions we have now about AI and generative AI, when I think about, what is human, what is machine, what is life, what is intelligence, this is not a new discussion. Europeans were talking about this in the 1800s. And so these debates around AI, whether it can take off human activities, are not as new as we might think. Except instead of now the defecating duck getting Europeans all excited, the world has got excited over ChatGPT instead. So I want to start there just by getting to think that the debates we're having now may seem new to us, but it's something that we as humans have been struggling with for several hundred years. And of course, these boundaries keep being pushed now. Like, for example, the equivalent today of these, the writer, these machines that could write might be something like this presenter created by the People's Daily in China, where essentially she's presenting the news and it looks, to all intents and purposes, real. And so we're seeing that this again is replicating what life looks like. Now, essentially, the way we think about this, and when we think about machines that are replicating what we do, writing news stories or running news websites, AI essentially is stimulating acts of journalism that would normally be associated with a human. Might be news writing, might be content moderation. And so when we think about AI in journalism, it really is both a practical concern, but also a philosophical concern, because it boils down to thinking about how we see what journalism is, could be, and should be, and how we see what the journalism does, what they are, who they are, what's their identity. Traditionally, in journalism, we define a journalist based on the people who do the work of journalism and the skills they perform to gather, produce, and report, share the news. And so I like this quote here because it says that when we think about new technologies, it's not about the technologies themselves, but rather it's about how we as journalists think about what we do and what belongs to us and doesn't. And this debate over the boundaries of journalism, the role of journalism, how we see ourselves, is not new. We've been here before. We've had 30 years of the internet and digitalization, and over those 30 years, advances in technology, changes in cultural practices and social practices have contested ways of being and doing in journalism. I look back, I used to study social media, and in 2009, only about half of journalists saw social media as important to their work. We fast forward to this year, to 2024, 97% of journalists are using social media in some way in their work. So again, we've had this debate before. When we see new technologies, we see them as challenging what journalists do and who they are. And then we find ways of how do we work with this? How do we think of understanding these new technologies, understanding how they change audiences, and how do we ensure that journalism continues to be relevant in this part? And with social media, whether we like it or not, Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue Sky, these have become part of the media infrastructure for dissemination, circulation, and consumption of news and information, for better or worse. And that's essentially what we're thinking about and going with AI, how we think of Gen AI becoming part of this media infrastructure. And so, as with every new technology, there's always a significant degree of fear and anxiety, because what's happening is an established way of communication, an established way of working is disrupted by the arrival of a new medium. We're seeing now with Gen AI, potentially, journalism transforming from, instead of Sky News, maybe in the future it'll be Skynet from the Terminator movies, running our newsrooms and producing the news. And this uncertainty over change and what's happening affects journalists. Of course it's going to do, because it shapes the way they think about what they do and what are the unique qualities they bring to the profession. And when journalists are surveyed about this, you get various trends. You get a difference between what journalists as professionals think of AI compared to what the industry and the news executives think of AI. So for industry leaders, AI is seen as a way of being more efficient, more cost-effective, doing more with less. But of course, from the side of the professional, they fear about undermining their authority, potentially replacing human journalists with robots, with algorithms. And journalists have concerns about how the audience might perceive what is produced by the newsroom if the content is generated by AI instead of by journalists. As with all new technologies, whether we like it or not, this is happening. So we have to contend with these changes. And you see here the shift in what's happening with AI. And we're seeing with these progressive ways of technology that the impact of change is faster and faster. So in this Reuters report in 2018, they found that more than 2/3 of industry leaders said they were using AI. And we go forward 4 years, And the same report by Nick Newman is saying that AI technologies are becoming a core part of every modern news operation at some level. So this might be through machine learning, deep learning, natural language processing, natural language generation. So AI is being woven into the way journalism works and the way news operations works. Whether we like it or not, this is happening. And to give you a sense of how it's shaping the media and creative industries, this is one report looking at the estimated value of AI, generative AI specifically, in media and entertainment. So it's not just about journalism, but about the general creative industries. And so you see that the value is estimated to go up from 1.7 billion this year to 11.5 billion in 2032. So this is huge growth, either people using cloud-based activities like ChatGPT or developing their own generative AI systems within their newsrooms, within their media companies, within their entertainment companies. This is what we're contending with. And this is happening. This is going to happen. And so for us, the question is, we're at a critical juncture. How do we think about Gen AI? And how do we use it in a way that boosts and supports journalism rather than undermine it? And the pace of change with Gen AI is outpacing what we saw with social media. You all will have lived through the arrival of social media and how disruptive that was with journalism, and how journalists had to learn to live with social media, had to learn to use social media, had to learn to understand social media. So to give you a sense of the pace of change here, in March of this year, ChatGPT, just ChatGPT alone, had 180 million users and 1.8 billion monthly visits. By comparison, this year, only about half of journalists surveyed worldwide said they were using tools like ChatGPT. So again, we're seeing pace of change outpacing in some ways the reaction and approach from journalists. And so my call here is that we need to learn to live with AI and use AI, and we need to do this now. We can't wait for several years to say what's going to happen. In some ways, this is what happened with social media. The audience adopted it before it became a mainstay in newsrooms. And then journalism had to adapt to what was happening there. My call is saying, how can we start leading the way in the use of AI rather than being responsive, as happened with a lot of the social media developments? So broadly speaking, if we look at what's happening now in newsroom, it's been used in three main areas. One is to gather the news, ways of using AI to analyze spreadsheets, to process huge amounts of data, to find information. Used in news production, from automated news production, algorithms writing news, to things like helping journalists with headlines, helping journalists with editing their work, etc. And then it's used in the distribution and recommendation of news. So having algorithms that personalize websites, that try to recommend things based on what people like. Netflix is the typical example of a recommendation engine powered by AI, where it looks at what you've seen and then says, well, if you watch this, you might like this as well. Google search results, this is already happening there. To give you a couple of examples then in terms of what is happening in this space. So news gathering, essentially sourcing information, potentially generating story ideas, identifying trends, events, issue monitoring, extracting information from the web or PDF documents. I've used this sometimes to extract details from a PDF document that would have taken me hours, or how to got one of my students to do it, it would have taken them hours to extract that information. You can drop that into ChatGPT, Google Gemini, all these other engines, and it will extract that information for you. It makes it very fast to do that. And so AI here can be proved really valuable in really creating certain journalistic tasks, making them more efficient and more effective for you, and gathering the data, and potentially in investigative reporting. If you have a huge amount of documents in PDF format, which is possibly the worst format for journalists, you can use AI engines to dig into that information and find pertinent stuff. So that's one of the big attractions here, using AI for faster processing and analysis of large data sets. Specifically, the AP is using it for local news. So AP has adopted this to try to identify things that would be of interest to its reporters. And it has a tool that uses AI to search and filter information that's posted on local government websites from across the US to look for news tips. So this might be a change to local regulations that might make for a good local news story. So some of these, when local governments make a change, it's published on their website, but it's hard to keep track. And so what this tool developed by AP does is that it essentially automates the process of looking at that data, analyzing the data, and then creates a dashboard that will provide tips on what has changed to journalists, essentially giving them a sense of there's been a shift in this regulation on, say, the collection of garbage, or there's been a change to the bylaws on pets, whatever, something like that, that would make for a good local news story that would be hard to monitor all the time, especially since often this is published in obscure government websites. So what AI does there is help them to find story tips. It doesn't write the story, but it gives ideas to journalists in terms of what is happening at a local level that might be important to report on. And when we're seeing a decline in local news reporting, particularly when it comes to the accountability of local government, this is a very powerful tool that AP has developed. It also, similarly, AP has a tool to monitor podcasts. And that works by transcribing the podcast. It searches for keywords that potentially might have, again, stories they could develop into news. And in the US context, this is particularly important given the rise of right-wing media and the rise of right-wing podcasts. So they can monitor all these right-wing podcasts. The journalist doesn't have to listen to hours of Joe Rogan or somebody else, because this tool will essentially transcribe and then analyze the data and look for keywords. Obviously, those keywords are decided by journalists, by editors, in terms of what they're looking for, and then potentially find a news nugget in that podcast that can be developed into a full story. So not only does it make it faster and more efficient, it potentially allows AP reporters to find stories that otherwise would be hidden, would be buried simply because there's too many hours of podcasting, there's too much material, too much stuff published on local government websites, and it's hard to find that information. Secondly, in news production, it's used to create content, to edit content, to package content for different formats using text, image, and video creation. And again, this is particularly important when we think of different audiences that access news, maybe not on the news website, but through platforms like TikTok or Instagram, and especially younger audiences. So how can you take what you've already done and think about creating it for these younger audiences? The BBC is testing this tool called graphical storytelling. And the idea here is to use AI to generate story graphics that they can then post to social media. So it's taking existing BBC news stories and then saying, how can we create graphics that break down that story, essentially designed for mobile, designed for social media, that would be more appealing to younger audiences. So again, the text and the news stories are all provided by journalists. And then this is then, once it's produced, it'll be overseen by a journalist before it goes out. And so it's trying to make, in this case, in this example, health stories more accessible and appealing, particularly to these younger audiences. And lastly, I want to give an example of news distribution and recommendation. And this is when we'll use AI engines to personalize, to market the news, to find audiences, to track and understand user behavior. And this is an example from Canada. Sophie was developed by the Globe and Mail, which is our equivalent in Canada of the New York Times. This was developed and launched by the Globe in 2015. It was developed with technologists, business people, and journalists working together. And the way what Sophie does essentially is it runs all the web properties and mobile properties belonging to the Globe, and it will make decisions on where stories get placed, the images they use, and also what goes behind a paywall or doesn't. What's interesting with Sophie is that it was, when they were developing it, journalists were involved in the development. So what would happen is the developers would create a version of Sophie, and journalists then would test it and say, yes, that's a good decision it's made, this is an important story, or no, this story is not that important, it shouldn't be so prominent on a homepage. So they helped to teach Sophie about editorial decision making. More importantly, what Sophie does is manage their paywall. The Globe and Mail, like a lot of other newspapers, operates with a dynamic paywall. So a certain number of stories are free, others are behind the paywall. What Sophie does is it tracks your behavior. So if you go to the Globe and Mail and look at a story, it might be free now. But Sophie then detects, oh, you're interested in stories from Vancouver. And what it does is locks stories from Vancouver. The idea being, if you want more of this, you're going to have to pay for it. In a way, it's giving you a free taste of something you're interested in before saying, now that you've tried it, become a subscriber. And the Globe credits this for increasing returns on their homepage, their subscriber rates. It's been lauded in the trade press. It's won numerous industry awards, and last year they sold it to a technology company. Sophie is used largely by media groups that have a lot of local news sites. So it's used in Australia, in the US, and Canada, and it's used to run these local news sites at scale, which means that you can run, say in Australia, 19 local news sites, mostly for small towns, without needing journalists to make those editorial decisions, and journalists focus on the reporting. But what we see from these examples is that essentially AI is being used to reflect and reinforce established journalistic practices, that it's focusing on what newsrooms do already, but maybe cheaper, faster, and more efficiently. And this is my critique of current approaches to AI in journalism, that really we're doing it to do what we've always done, rather than rethinking what is it that we could do. And for this, I want to give you the example of automated stories. The use of AI to generate news is very appealing. You can create lots of news stories at scale. It's been around for almost 10 years now. The LA Times was doing this using rather basic algorithms in 2015 to report on earthquakes and then to report on homicides in LA. And national news agencies like the Canadian Press here in Canada or the Press Association in the UK, I have been using automation now for over 5-6 years to create stories at scale. And of course, this is going to gather more pace with the rise of Gen AI. So for example, the Canadian Press here, it uses AI to generate short stories on the Canadian job market. And so once a month, when the figures come out for unemployment, whether jobs have gone up or gone down, they can generate 130 stories that they can spread across Canada. So Vancouver will get a version of what's happened to jobs in Vancouver, which is different to the version that would get in Toronto, in Montreal, in other countries. In the UK, which has been doing this as the Press Association for years now, they launched in 2018, and between 2018 and 2021, over 3 years, they had 5 journalists who filed 400,000 stories. So 400,000 stories over 3 years by a team of 5 journalists. And that's because all of this was automated with some human oversight. And you can see why this is appealing. It's an appealing prospect to newsroom leaders, to business executives, given the continuing financial challenges of commercial journalism. But at the same time, it's a daunting prospect to journalists who may fear that they're being usurped by technology, undermining what they do and how they do it. The other question is it better for audiences? So here are 2 stories from the UK, one by the Warrington Guardian, the other by the Daily Echo in Bournemouth. Both of these are very much traditional local newspapers. Now, when you look at both of these, which one was written by a human and which one was written by an algorithm? The thing is, it's a trick question. Both of them started off as algorithmic stories. So one of them had a little bit more human intervention than the other, the Daily Echo, but both of them essentially came from the National Press Agency, the Press Association, reporting, and again, on national statistics. So what's interesting with automated stories is this is already appearing, and people are seeing this, but they may not necessarily know that it's automated. And what some of the studies show is that readers often find it hard to distinguish if an article is written by a human or written by a machine. And when they're asked what they prefer, the results are very mixed. So in one study, people said they preferred stories written by humans because they were more readable. So readability, humans scored high. But when they were asked about credibility, the readers here, the people in this study, said they preferred machine-written stories for credibility. So they trusted machines for credibility better than humans, but they thought humans were better writers. And then in another story, in another study, looking again at how people reacted to stories, some people thought that automated stories were more credible in politics. So a political story was more credible written by a machine than by a human. But if it was a human interest story, they preferred it written by a human. So in some ways, when people react to these stories, it's less about the stories and their own biases. They might think that somebody writing about politics is biased, but a machine isn't. And if it's a story about human interest, then a human would be better at writing that. So the upshot is we don't really know what audiences prefer. We don't really understand how they understand automated stories and whether it's good or bad for them. But I think there's a bigger question here for us as journalists, and that is the value of news. In some ways, news was based on scarcity. We as journalists would decide this is what's important, this is what the audience needs to pay attention to, and then give them a selection of events in the country and across the world saying, pay attention to this. What happens when the cost of producing news is almost zero, where you can produce 130 stories on job statistics for really no cost? And you're doing it in a way that replicates the news pyramid, the way of saying what's most important first, why it matters, and the context. And this is a format that was developed because of a previous technology, the telegraph, more than 200 years ago. So we're using AI to replicate a way of journalism that rose out of a different technology, the telegraph 200 years ago, which I find rather mind-blowing that we're doing something that we did 200 years ago and using this amazing new tool to replicate what we did with the telegraph. It just doesn't add up in my mind. But more importantly, what the automated stories do is that it really is about facts. And when we think about what people need from journalism, what they need from us, in some ways, people don't need more facts. They need knowledge. They need context. They need understanding. And these automated news stories don't really provide that knowledge. It provides information. It doesn't provide that context. And because there's such an abundance of news, in some ways, it undermines the value of news. It undermines the value of saying this is what's important. Because if everything gets a news story, how are we going to signal to the audience, pay attention to this and not that, when we're just giving them everything? So there's a real question here about automation, like, is this actually better for audiences? Is it better for society? Is it better for journalism? Or are we undermining the value of journalists and journalism? And in a way, showing that we can be replaced because a machine can do this. So I want to end by talking about a couple of examples here. And this is the sort of choices that we have to make. Automated stories have been around for years, but we're now seeing things like Google search, generative search, and things like Perplexity with their Discover feature that essentially are not just generating a news story, but actually giving us essentially the news story, explanation, and a summary. So this is an example from Perplexity Discover on a story there. It gives you the introduction, and you can see at the bottom of the screen that it gives you the sources. But what this does is, as you can see, it gives you the introduction, what happened, the incident details, gives you some background on the financial impact, why it matters for NATO, and then safety concerns and precedents. So what's remarkable with this is that this summary of the news doesn't just tell me what happened, it also explains why it matters, and explains why it matters for fishermen, explains why it matters for NATO. And while it still provides the links to the original news stories, I do wonder whether I actually have to click through and read any of those news stories, because effectively everything I need to know is here. Perplexity also have a daily podcast called Discover Daily, which again offers a blend of stories, all AI generated. So when we think of the Daily from the New York Times or other programs like that, well, Perplexity can do that for you, completely automated. So if we have people starting to use these kind of systems, will they ever need to click on a news story and go to your website? Secondly, I want to give the example of a product by Google. This is Google Notebook LM. And this is disrupting research. It's disrupting my teaching. Because what Notebook LM does, essentially, it's your AI research assistant. You can upload a PDF, a website link, a YouTube video, audio files, Google Docs, Google Slides. And what Notebook LM will do is it will summarize it. It will make connections between topics. It will give you a study guide. It will give you a briefing doc. So I look at this and I ask my students to read academic papers and look at studies. Well, they don't need to read them anymore. They just can upload it here, and Google will do their thinking for them. We'll give them a summary. We'll give them the key points. And you see it also says audio overview. So what Notebook LM will do is also create a 12 to 15-minute little podcast on whatever you've uploaded. And I've tried this with some of my own research, and it does a sort of American NPR style discussion on the paper. And it's not perfect, but it's 80 to 90% perfect. And so suddenly, you almost think, well, why my students need me where they can do this study guide? I'm actually going to introduce this in class this week and think in terms of how can we use it to supplement the teaching. So it doesn't replace me, but actually it helps me help the students navigate through complex issues and a lot of academic writing, which, to be honest, often isn't the hardest, the easiest to read and quite hard. But for journalism, think of using something like this around thinking and brainstorming. So, this is one where I uploaded a paper that I've written on AI, and the little summary there. And the summary is pretty good. That's what my paper was about. So we need to think in terms of the choices we're going to make. The use of AI in journalism, as in other creative industries, is redrawing these boundaries between human and machine, much like the automata of the 18th century did. Make us question what is human, what is artificial, and where do we fit into this? And it's shaping how we think about journalistic labor and identity. I would suggest that it's less about thinking of journalism in opposition to AI and more in conversation with AI, much like journalism has been in conversation with the internet, with social media. We need to think about how to work with these technologies and cultural changes. And so we need to find a way of living with AI, knowing it is there and thinking about what is it that we do that cannot be replaced by AI. So I think there's three ways of thinking about this. We can cohabit. We can essentially say, Gen AI is there, ChatGPT is there, but what we do can't be replaced and we will carry on doing what we do. So it's happening alongside us, but we can't be replaced. I would suggest that if anybody thinks they can't be replaced, they will be replaced. It may not be as good, but potentially it'll be cheaper, more efficient, more effective. And the history of technology and innovation shows us that often existing products or companies are replaced by new products and companies that do what they do, perhaps not as well initially, but they're good enough for most people. Our second choice is to collaborate with AI, find ways of working with AI. And in some ways, this is what's happening now in journalism. AI being largely used to address existing immediate priorities, better distribution, more local stories at lower cost, better headlines, automated translation. Essentially, we're collaborating with AI to do what journalists have always done, just maybe faster, more efficiently, and cheaper. But from my perspective, we really need to move to the third phase, which is thinking of integrating AI into journalism and into what we do. Find ways of building AI into what journalism is, could be, and should be. And this means making some really hard choices. For me, this means thinking about what can AI do that replaces what journalists do? What can AI do better than journalists do themselves? And once we ask those questions, we then said, what is left for the human journalist to do? So it's less about saying, this is what I do and I can't be replaced by AI, but reversing that thinking. What can AI do that I currently do now? What can it replace? What can it do? Maybe not as well, but cheaper, more effectively. And then what is left for journalism? What then makes journalism unique in that question? And essentially, this then becomes a new role where you have AI editors who work hand in hand with these systems. So they're less of assistants to journalists, but are rather part of the newsroom. They're integrated into how we think and work in journalism. The question to leave you with is that this might lead us to think in terms of, how do we rethink journalism? Currently, we're using it to essentially reinvent what we've always done, doing things we always do, just better, faster, more efficiently. But if we go beyond that, how can we rethink what we can do with this technology? How can we change our mindsets to be more experimental, to take risks, to think about, yes, what can be replaced? And when we think about what can be replaced, what is left then for journalists? What is the unique thing we bring as humans to journalism that AI machines can't do? But to do that, we need to think about what can be replaced. It requires a broader mindset where the fundamentals of journalism are questioned, and in some ways, nothing is taken as sacred.